All stories of this place end the same, in silence and empty tables, but to understand the end, you must witness the beginning. So how did it all start? Stay until the very end, and you will hear the very story that unfolded at this table tonight. An empty tavern has its own distinct music. You can't hear it during the day when the place is buzzing with people. But now in this short hour between the last daytime customer leaving and the first evening guests arriving, it plays especially clear. It's the music of preparation, unhurried, almost ritualistic. The owner of the establishment, a man whose face bears more marks from years behind the counter than from hard manual labor, slowly circles the room. His gaze glides over the tables as if reading the history of last night from the scratches in the wood and the dark stains of spilled ale. He isn't just cleaning, he is restoring order to his small kingdom. The faint creak of a floorboard under his foot, the dull thud of an overturned bench being righted, these are the first notes of the evening symphony. His silent assistant, a woman with arms made strong from carrying trays, has already begun her work. Her movements are economical and precise. With a soft, measured thud, she places heavy clay mugs on the tables. Each thud is a period, a comma in the coming conversation of the night. Next come the wooden trenchers, the rough spoons. She works in silence, but her presence fills the room with a sense of busy calm. And in the fireplace, a small miracle of rebirth is taking place. During the day, the fire smoldered, saving warmth. Now, with the addition of dry logs and a few confident strokes of the leather bellows, it wakes up. The embers flare crimson, tongues of flame crackle and embrace the new fuel, and heat begins to radiate in waves, driving the evening damp from the stone walls. This isn't just lighting a fire, it's igniting the tavern's heart. Above the flames, on a heavy iron hook, a massive cauldron already sways. Soon the first, barely perceptible scent of the evening stew will begin to creep from it, an aroma that will beckon weary travelers more surely than any sign. Outside the door, you can hear the world gradually preparing for sleep. The cries of the last vendors, hurried footsteps on the cobblestones, the distant bark of dogs. But inside a focused anticipation reigns. The owner approaches the ale barrel, checks the tap. The door did not open on the third knock. The owner, as if letting the guest know that there was no hurry here, had paused after the second thud. Now in the doorway, draped in gray twilight, stood three men. Not shadows or ghosts, but the most flesh and blood. Familiar to every wrinkle embodiment of evening, they were regulars. Thomas the Mason, his hands forever stained the pale color of lime. Harold the blacksmith, whose shoulder width barely allowed him to squeeze through the doorframe. And ever fidgety Jacques the wool merchant, whose eyes even now seeking comfort, darted around the room, assessing the empty tables. Evening Bartholomew, they creaked in unison, stepping over the threshold, and the cold from the street, like a living thing, crept in after them, making the flames in the fireplace shudder and sway. Evening, the owner Bartholomew nodded curtly, stepping aside to let them pass. His gaze, a second ago the all-seeing eye of the lord of an empty kingdom, now became the gaze of a maitre d', quick, assessing, recognizing. They did not simply enter a room, they entered their ritual. Thomas, without looking, reached for the hook by the door and hung his worn cloak. Harold, with a dull thud, set his hefty wooden mallet by the threshold, a tool he carried even after his shift, as if it were the scepter of his authority. Jake rubbed his hands together, already forming in his mind the first question about barley prices. Their movement through the hall was slow, heavy, like the movement of glaciers. They did not choose a table, they occupied it. That very one, the large table by the fireplace, which still bore a barely noticeable scar from someone's knife from the night before. The benches creaked under their weight, accepting a familiar load. And here, magic happened, not loud, not visible to the eye, but perceptible to the ear. The silence, that same tense silence of a stage, burst. But it did not explode with noise. Instead, it began to slowly fill with new living sounds. It was the sound of shed fatigue. Thomas heaved a heavy sigh, and that exhale was the first true voice of the evening. Harold tapped his knuckles on the table, once, twice beating his own unhurried rhythm. Jacques snapped his fingers, catching the eye of the assistant, Alice, and gestured toward the empty mugs, a gesture that required no words, and the world outside finally receded. Bartholomew was already at the barrel. The clear, rich sound of the opening tap cut through the air. It was followed by another, the thick, velvety, bubbling gurgle of ale pouring into an earthen vessel. This was the main bass instrument in the evening's emerging orchestra. Alice moved between the tables, carrying 3 overflowing mugs. Her movements half an hour ago, the only ones in the silence, now became part of a common dance. She deftly set the drinks before the guests, and in the sounds of payment, the dull clunk of copper coins on the counter, lay the very essence of this place: goods, warmth, exchange. The first sips were taken in silence with eyes closed. It was a sacred moment. Then Thomas licked the foam from his mustache and uttered the first meaningful word of the night. "So how's that wall by the Count's gate?" And off it went. Not in a torrent, but like a slow, viscous river. Talk of work, the price of iron, the blacksmith's stubborn horse, rumors from the high road, their voices low and raspy, wove into a dense, lulling hum. This hum was a shield. It walled off the little island of warmth and familiarity from the vast, cold, unfamiliar world beyond the oak door. The fireplace no longer burned alone. Now it accompanied this hum with the crackling of logs, the spit of sparks. Hearth smoke mingled with the smoke from clay pipes, which the guests now slowly packed. The air grew thick, tangible, composed of the smells of ale, sweat, wood, warm wool, and the roasting meat from the cauldron. Bartholomew, standing behind the counter, washed an already used mug. His face showed nothing, but the corners of his eyes held the faintest beginnings of crow's feet, the first signs not of a smile, but of simple, silent satisfaction. Order had been restored. The cycle was complete. The tavern was fulfilling its function. Alice, having taken her observational post, no longer stared into emptiness. Her eyes, sharp as a forest bird, softly glided from face to face, reading moods, anticipating gestures. She was the conductor of this small, spontaneous orchestra, and it was she who first noticed the change in the sound from outside. The cries of vendors and the barking of dogs had long since died away. Now only rare, hurried, solitary footsteps of belated passers-by echoed on the cobblestones beyond the door. And then came a short, absolute silence, the kind that happens just before a change of scenery. The footsteps that came next were different. Not heavy and confident like those of the locals, and not hurried and light like those of townsfolk. They were measured. An even, deliberate, alien rhythm. Step, pause, step. Pause. The conversation by the fireplace did not cease, but a barely perceptible crack of inattention appeared in it. The blacksmith herald broke off his story for a moment. The footsteps stopped right in front of the door. There was no knock of a fist. There was another sound, light yet distinct, the scrape of metal on wood, as if someone hesitant to enter had leaned a staff or a sword hilt against the door. Bartholomew slowly put down the rag he was using to wipe the counter. His gaze met Alice's. In her eyes he read the same thing he felt himself. The tide had ended. Now something else was beginning. The evening in the tavern took its first deep breath and held it, waiting for the exhale. The door did not swing wide. It moved just enough for a single figure to slip through the gap, and that gap, a second ago merely a hole in the wall, suddenly became a frame for a portrait that clearly did not belong in this gallery. He did not enter like the locals, not heavily with noise and a cloud of breath. He entered like a shadow, smoothly, almost soundlessly, allowing the door to close behind him with a soft click, as if he controlled its movement. The cold that entered with him was different. Not fresh and street-born, but old, damp, as if brought from a deep forest or a stone dungeon. And then the hum, that dense, cozy hum of the evening popped, not sharply, but like a soap bubble touching a twig. Conversations broke off mid-word. Laughter died, turning into a stifled cough. Even the fire in the fireplace seemed to hush, and its light became nervous and jumping. Every eye, as if on command, turned to the door, but they did not look at the face. They looked at the overall shape. He was tall, but not from height, from leanness and a back as straight as a spear shaft. A cloak of thick, worn wool, the color of wet earth, hung from his shoulders, concealing his frame. The hood was drawn, his face sunk in deep shadow, from which only the tip of his nose and a narrow strip of chin were visible. In his right hand, he leaned not on a staff, but on a long sheathed object, either a bundle or a scabbard. It was with this that he had scraped the door. He did not look at the room, his head, slightly tilted, slowly turned, assessing the space. His gaze, invisible but tangible, like the touch of cold metal, slid over the walls, the tables, the faces frozen in a silent question. He was not looking for an empty seat, he was assessing the territory. Bartholomew did not stir. He became part of the counter, his fingers still resting on the wood, damp from spilled ale, but his eyes, usually half closed, were now wide open. He saw not just a wayfarer, he saw a type, a man of the road, not a merchant, not a pilgrim, but one who walks not towards something, but away from everything. And such men usually carried not goods or blessings, but trouble. The stranger finished his assessment, his invisible gaze fixed on Bartholomew, and then he moved. His footsteps on the floorboards did not clatter. They whispered dully, as if under his boots were not oak, but grass. He did not head for the fireplace for the warmth. He chose a table in the farthest corner, in the gathering shadow, with his back to the wall and his face to the entrance, a table where no one sat during the day. Settling onto the bench, he made no sound. He placed his long bundle on the table before him, laid both hands on top, palms down, and went still. The silence in the tavern grew thick as gruel. The first to break it was Harold the blacksmith. He snorted, took a drink from his mug, set it down with a clunk too loud for the quiet. But it was a gesture, nothing more. Even he did not dare to speak. And then it was Bartholomew who moved. He detached himself from the counter with the same slow, deliberate grace with which he did everything. He was the master here. And a master cannot allow silence to stretch longer than 30 heartbeats. He walked across the entire hall, and the sound of his footsteps was the only clear sound in the universe. He stopped 2 paces from the corner table, not approaching. He crossed his arms over his chest. "What can I get for you?" his voice asked, even devoid of friendliness but also without hostility. A voice stating a fact. From the shadow of the hood came a sound. Not a voice at first, but a sound. A light, dry clearing of the throat, as if from a man long unused to speech. "Ale," the stranger finally uttered. His voice was low, emotionless, slightly hoarse as if from a cold. "And something to eat, whatever you have." "There's stew," said Bartholomew. "Stew," repeated the stranger as if tasting the word. Yes. He did not ask the price. Instead, his right hand vanished beneath his cloak and reappeared, and onto the wood before him, with a soft but distinct clink, fell several coins, not of local mint. The silver was dull, almost black, with foreign worn faces. Bartholomew looked at the coins, nodded exactly once, turned and walked back to the counter. His departure seemed to loosen invisible vice grips. Someone in the hall cautiously grunted. Someone began to whisper, only to be cut short by a neighbor's heavy look. The stranger did not move. He sat, hands on his bundle, facing the room, submerged in the shadow of his hood. He was not looking at anyone in particular. He was simply watching, and his silent presence was no longer an emptiness, but an active, pressing force. It divided the hall into 2 parts: the familiar, warm, noisy world by the fireplace, and the cold, silent island in the corner, where sat the very embodiment of the unknown. The evening was no longer just an evening. A splinter had been driven into it, and now everyone could feel it digging into the flesh of habitual time. Bartholomew took his time. He did not bring the stew and ale immediately. He let the stranger settle into his corner, let the hall grow accustomed to his presence as a fact. Only when the rhythm, that same halting, nervous rhythm, had re-established itself did he move. He carried the tray not as a servant, but as an envoy. A wooden bowl of steaming stew, a mug of dark ale, a coarse hunk of bread, each item in its place. His footsteps were still the only clear sound, but now they sounded like part of a protocol. He set the tray on the edge of the table, directly across from the stranger's hands resting on the bundle. Not too close, not familiar. At arm's length. "Your order," Bartholomew said in a voice that held neither hospitality nor distaste. The voice of a man fulfilling a duty. From the shadow of the hood came that dry cough again. The stranger's hand, his right, clad in a worn leather glove with the fingers cut off, slowly lifted from the bundle and reached for the mug. He did not pick it up, he merely cupped it in his palm, feeling its weight and temperature. His fingers tapped lightly on the clay. Tap, tap. "My thanks," he uttered. His voice seemed a little less hoarse, but no warmer. Bartholomew did not leave. He waited. He knew the order was only the beginning. The real price is always named after the goods are delivered. The stranger took his first sip, a long, slow one. A shadow of movement traveled down his throat. He set the mug down and finally raised his head. The light from the hall, falling at a low angle, briefly snatched from under the hood the lower part of his face. A narrow, pale chin, thin, tightly pressed lips. No eyes were visible. "You know these locals?" the stranger said. It was not a question, it was a statement. "I know them." Bartholomew nodded, crossing his arms. "Then perhaps you know others who passed through recently." By the fireplace, the blacksmith herald suddenly laughed loudly. The laugh was false, strained, and it cut off immediately, swallowed by a sudden silence. Everyone pretended not to be listening, but their backs were taut as bowstrings. People pass through every day, Bartholomew parried. Some go east, others west. Some come in here, some don't. The stranger leaned forward just an inch. It was enough for his whisper, low and viscous as tar, to reach Bartholomew's ears without reaching the others. I'm looking for one. A man, around 40, with a scar. Here. He pressed his cut-off glove to his own cheek, drawing a diagonal line from his cheekbone to the corner of his mouth. They say he was here, perhaps a week ago, perhaps 2. Bartholomew did not blink. Inside him, everything clenched into a cold, hard knot. He knew that man, had seen that scar. That man had drunk ale here, talked too much, and paid with Spanish silver reals, and had left north on the forest road. But Bartholomew's eyes, years trained to show nothing, remained empty. There are many scars here, he said slowly, from axes, from plows, from drunken brawls. Your scar, what made it? A pause hung between them, thick and heavy. The stranger leaned back, disappearing into shadow again. His fingers returned to the bundle. A sword came from the darkness, and in that word lay the entire story that needed no addition. A sword leaves a clear memory, Bartholomew remarked. Such a man is hard to miss. Precisely. I haven't seen him. It was a lie, pure, polished, delivered with the same calm as the truth. Bartholomew stared directly into the shadow where the eyes should have been. The stranger went still. He seemed not to breathe. Then came a quiet, short sound. Not quite a sigh, not quite a scoff. A pity, he said, for him and perhaps for others. The threat was not spoken. It hung in the air between the words, like the smell of a coming storm. Bartholomew nodded as if they had just discussed the price of hay, turned and walked back to the counter. His back was straight, his steps measured, but every muscle in it was tensed, braced for a blow that never came. He could feel the stranger's gaze, heavy and sticky, following him across the entire hall. Alice, standing by the ale barrel, met his eyes. In hers, he read not a question, but understanding. She had heard, not the words, but the tone, and that was enough. The stranger became motionless once more, but his stillness was of a different quality now. It was the stillness of a decision made, of a bowstring drawn taut, and something in the hall broke. That fragile piece, held together by the silent agreement to ignore the threat, crumbled. Whispers grew louder, glances quicker. Someone by the fireplace stood up, stretched with exaggerated nonchalance, and went out into the yard, slamming the door. The words quietly spoken in the corner had done their work. They had poisoned the air. They had divided the room into those who knew about the sword scar and those who suspected. And Bartholomew himself, who, the tension injected into the hall by the whisper about the scar did not dissipate. It crystallized like sugar in overheated syrup. It hung in the air, mixing with the smoke and the smell of ale, making every sip bitter and every chuckle false. The spark that set it all ablaze was the blacksmith, Harold, or rather, his patience, which had always been as short as a fuse. He listened as Jacques, the wool merchant, began the same argument about prices with the mason Thomas for what felt like the 100th time. Usually this was background noise, familiar as the squeak of a wheel, but today Jacques' voice sawed at the nerves like a dull blade. I'm telling you, if the Count raises the bridge toll, I'll have to raise the price of my broadcloth. Jacques insisted shrilly, jabbing a finger into Thomas's chest. And what's that to me? Thomas bellowed, who now smelled not of lime, but of fermented hops. Your cloth won't keep me any warmer. You can't wrap stonework in it. Harold silently drilled his gaze into his mug. His enormous hand squeezed the clay so hard it seemed it would crack. And when Jacques, in the heat of the argument, jerked clumsily and spilled the dregs of his ale directly onto the blacksmith's wide leather breeches, the cup overflowed. There was no silence, there was sound. A dull, bestial roar erupted from Harold's chest. Not a word, but pure primal rage. He shot up so violently that the heavy bench scraped back with a crash and loomed over Jacques like a thundercloud. His entire mighty frame trembled with fury. You spilled on me, he ground out, and each word was like a hammer blow on an anvil. Jacques shrank into the back of the bench, his eyes wide with sudden drunken terror. Harold, it was an accident. I swear I... Shut your mouth! Harold's roar drowned out everything. A dead, icy silence fell over the hall. Even the fire in the fireplace seemed to hush. Everyone froze. Thomas, his hand raised mid-gesture. The other craftsman, Alice behind the counter. Bartholomew, who had already taken a step forward. And in this silence from his corner came a new sound. Not loud, but clear as a bell strike. A tap. The stranger set his wooden spoon down on the edge of his bowl. Once. Calmly. As if placing a period. This sound brought Harold back from the primal fog of rage into the room. His gaze, crazed and bloodshot, darted from Jacques' pale face to the corner, to the one who dared make a sound while he, Harold, was roaring. And then Alice stepped in. She did not scream. She did not throw herself between them. She simply walked to the ale barrel, took an empty tin mug, and with a swing, hurled it onto the stone floor at Harold's feet. The crash was deafening. The metal shrieked as it bounced off the stone and spun like a top, ringing with a piercing, maddening chime. Everyone instinctively flinched, covering themselves. Harold recoiled as if from a whip crack. In the ringing silence that followed the crash, her voice cut through, thin, cold, sharp as a blade. Enough, said Alice, and in that single word was such icy contempt for all this male, drunken, stupid brawling that Harold lowered his fists. He stood there breathing heavily, looking from her to the still ringing mug on the floor. Bartholomew used that second. He positioned himself between the blacksmith and Jacques, not touching them, simply occupying the space. Calm down, Harold, he said, and his voice was low and firm like the very stone underfoot. He spilled on you. You scared him half to death. The score's even. Sit, drink. It was an order, not a request, and in it was all the receding authority of the master of this place. Harold, still grunting, slowly like an ox being unyoked, sank back onto the bench. Jacques, unable to utter a word, just nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. But the venom had been spilled, and the fight that had been prevented with fists was now happening in the air. The glances the former drinking companions threw at each other were sharp and full of hatred. Harold's shame, Jacques' fear, Thomas's helplessness, all mixed into a heavy, combustible brew. And in the corner, in the shadows, the stranger was slowly, methodically finishing his stew. His spoon rose and fell with inhuman regularity. He observed this little collapse not as a witness, but as a naturalist recording the result of an experiment. The spark, struck by his words, had fallen on fertile ground and produced the expected smoke of quarrel. He hadn't even touched his ale. Bartholomew, returning behind the counter, felt a strange emptiness. His words still held some power. His assistant had managed to douse the flare-up, but they had been fighting the symptom, not the cause. The cause sat in the corner, finishing his stew, and was invincible. The evening was hopelessly ruined. This was no longer a tavern, but a battlefield after a skirmish, where the wounded pick gleefully at their wounds, and there is no victor. Only the smell of fear, shame, and inescapable future trouble. And when the last sound of the ringing mug faded, what settled in the hall was not the silence of anticipation as before. What settled was deafness, the deafness of defeat. He left first. Naturally, no one saw the moment. They were distracted by their own shame, their own anger, the ringing in their own ears. And when a gaze like a tentacle drifted back to the corner, he was already gone. The table was empty, the wooden bowl scoured clean. The clay mug with its undrunk ale stood precisely in the center, like a monument to itself. Not a crumb, not a drop, no hint that anyone had sat there. Only on the tabletop where those foreign coins had lain remained a dark, damp spot of condensation. It was slowly evaporating. His departure was as abrupt as the tap of a spoon on wood, and just as final. This disappearance, not the fight, became the signal for dissolution. The spell was broken, the languor was over. Harold was the first to rise. Without a word, without looking at anyone, he simply took his mallet by the door, threw on his cloak, and walked out into the night. The door closed behind him with a soft, definitive click. Jacques, meeting no one's eyes, scurried after him, his fidgety shadow flickering in the doorway and vanishing, one by one. No parting jokes, no promises of tomorrow. They simply stood up and left, carrying away the shards of the shattered evening. The tavern exhaled them as lungs exhale poisoned air. Within 10 minutes, the hall was empty. Only the two of them remained, and the heavy, oppressive silence that not even the crackle of the fire could fill anymore. The fireplace was burning down. Alice was the first to break the silence. She walked to that very table in the corner and picked up the mug with the undrunk ale. She held it up to the light. The dark liquid was still, cold. She poured it into the slop bucket behind the counter. The sound of the falling liquid was unexpectedly loud. Then she began collecting the empty mugs and bowls. Her movements were as economical as they had been in the evening, but now they held no readiness, only fatigue. Simple, physical fatigue at the end of a long day. Bartholomew stood behind the counter, counting the takings. Copper and silver coins clinked dully into his palm. Among them were those, dull with foreign profiles. He set them aside in a separate stack, a separate history. "He's gone," Alice said, placing the last clean mug on the shelf. It wasn't a question. "He's gone," Bartholomew confirmed, not looking at her. Did he find what he was looking for? Bartholomew weighed the stack of foreign coins in his hand. They were cold. "No," he answered, "but now they're looking for him." He walked to the fireplace, took the poker, and carefully stirred the burnt-out logs. A cloud of sparks swirled upward and died in the darkness of the chimney. The flame finally yielded to the steady crimson glow of the embers. They finished their work in complete silence, extinguished all the candles but one, slid the bolt on the door. The tavern sank into semi-darkness, lit only by the dying hearth and a thin strip of moonlight piercing through a crack in the shutter. Bartholomew sat on that very bench at the far table from which Alice had observed the evening. She sat opposite him. Between them on the table lay that same stack of foreign coins. They did not speak, there was no need. They simply sat in the silence of their kingdom, which in one evening had been attacked, tested for strength, and remained standing, empty but whole. And then the fire in the fireplace went out completely, turning to warm ash. The moonlight became the sole master of the room. It lay upon the empty tables in cold silver slabs. Alice sighed, stood up, took her candle. "Good night, Bart." "Good night, Alice." Her footsteps faded on the stairs leading to the living quarters. Bartholomew sat in the dark for a few minutes more, listening to the stone cooling, the wood creaking. Then he stood, walked to the door, checked the bolt once more. His shadow, huge and insubstantial, darted across the wall and dissolved. He took the last candle and went inside the house. The tavern was left alone, with empty tables, with the smell of smoke, ale, and a quiet, lived history, with 3 foreign coins on the table by the window, which now silently waited for morning, and with it for a new day and a new story, which would inevitably come with the first dusk, for the doors of the weary traveler are always open, and its heart, the fire in the hearth, will always be ready to flare up again. And so, the last light in the tavern goes out. The tale of this evening has been told. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If you enjoyed this nighttime journey into the past, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Here at the Goodnight Lecture Hall, every video is a new portal to another world, and we'd love to have you back. Be sure to check out our story about a day in a medieval village. You'll find the link on the screen. Rest well, and until we meet again in the quiet of history.